Well, we can now, rather belatedly, cross to Brussels. The French leader, Emmanuel Macron, is just setting up to speak there. Let's listen in.
In just a few minutes, I wanted to tell you about the summit of NATO and the G7 that we've just held here with all of my colleagues, and to give you an update. 1 month after Russia invaded Ukraine, where do we stand? The Ukrainian people, led by their president, has resisted undermining Russia's plans for a very swift military victory. With our European partners, we've had a united and very firm stand, whereas Russia was also expecting a weak and divided response. We will continue to assist Ukraine with military and humanitarian assistance with unprecedented means. There are more than 3.5 refugees now in Europe, and our determination has led us to implement unprecedented sanctions. And the Russian economy is now in default of payment, and our pressure will only increase in order, by all means possible, to reach a ceasefire and peace. These initiatives that we have launched will continue. Just a few minutes ago, the humanitarian resolution brought by France and Mexico was voted with a very large majority at the UN General Assembly, with 140 votes for, only 5 against, which shows how isolated Russia remains. Russia has taken historic responsibility in launching this war, and our strategy is to do our utmost to stop all escalation and to cease the conflict as quickly as possible through support to Ukraine, through sanctions, and through continued talks with President Putin to be able to find ways and means to come up with a negotiated solution. The NATO summit this morning allowed us to enact several elements. First of all, we unanimously agreed to reinforce support to Ukraine with defensive weapons, with equipment that it needs. President Zelensky spoke to us this morning, stating his needs very clearly. And our posture is the same, to continue to provide defensive and lethal weapons to Ukraine, with a red line, of course, which is to not be a co-belligerent. This is also why I will not go into detail. But with the German Chancellor and other Europeans, we have also insisted on the importance of continuing to negotiate. The second outcome of our summit is the necessity to prevent any escalation of the conflict and to never give any pretext to Russia to provoke an escalation. NATO made a choice, which is to support Ukraine to stop the war without going to war. Therefore, we've decided to intensify our ongoing work to prevent any escalation and to get organized in case there is an escalation. And lastly, we decided to pursue adapting our posture given this new situation in Ukraine and to adapt to those circumstances. And let me say that France is present. We are in full solidarity to ensure the safety of our allies in the north and in the south and in the eastern flank. The map that you have here clearly shows our current commitments, which have been strengthened over the past weeks. In Norway, an exercise that France is taking part in, we're a major contributor. We have 3,200 troops on the ground. So strong commitment, and I would like to repeat how sorry I am and my condolences for the American losses during this exercise. In Estonia, we have decided to maintain and even to reinforce our presence. We have about 350 troops with missions that were also strengthened. We've increased our troops on the ground and also in the air. France is taking part in these missions in policing the skies for our Baltic friends. Above Poland and in the southeast of the alliance, we've also strengthened our presence. As you can see, we decided to contribute to air forces in Poland, and then in the south, our willingness to contribute air support and to increase our capacity in Romania and Bulgaria to be able to deploy all necessary means. Also, surveillance in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the choice that I announced at the beginning of the year to the European Parliament to be able to commit to the NRF 550 French troops with the contribution of several other member states and in Romania, which will certainly be strengthened with the help of Belgium and the Netherlands. As you can see, from the north to the south, France is a very concrete contributor to this alliance and to the strategic rearmament of Europe, which I called for before the European Parliament. All of this shows the coherence of our actions. We need a strong Europe of defense. We need to take our responsibilities. We have to show that Europe is a true component of NATO and not a substitute nor competition. And I believe that we have lent credibility to this message over the past few weeks. We've also been working over the past weeks, and we'll be continuing later to work on the strategic compass, which will also allow us to establish a joint position with NATO at the Madrid summit to draw the consequences of the exercises we launched at the end of 2019. I believe it's important that we reorganize our strategic efforts and review our contribution within the alliance. And all of this is maturing at a time when we are all being tested. And I believe that in response to this test and the war launched in Ukraine is the response we are currently providing. The G7 summit completed this response in other ways. First of all, in terms of sanctions, we have very tight coordination. And these sanctions were implemented very quickly. There were 4 types of sanctions from the very second day from the launch of the conflict, and we have constantly responded as Europeans. And those 4 series of sanctions were perfectly coordinated, and we decided on a mechanism within the G7 to continue those sanctions and to monitor them to ensure they are fully implemented to prevent any differences between members, which would weaken the group's coherence, and also to measure, to pool our lists of oligarchs, to work together with our ministries of defense and finance, to implement these decisions, and then, of course, to prepare future decisions if necessary, and we are fully ready to tighten sanctions whenever necessary. We have also collectively decided to mobilize friendly powers who are not necessarily part of the G7, members of the European Union, or members of NATO, to limit the strategies in assisting Russia in overcoming these sanctions. Currently, the sanctions are having an impact. I recently mentioned the financial difficulties of Russia, so the impact is tangible, and we must continue to have a dissuasive effect. We've also established a calendar for solidarity, because there is an asymmetry in the consequences of the war on the members of the G7 and of NATO, and this requires solidarity. First of all, in managing the refugee crisis. Europe, logically, due to its geography, is the main contributor. There are between 6.5 and 7 million displaced Ukrainians currently. 3.5 Ukrainians are now in Europe. This is one of the most difficult challenges that Europe has had to face since the end of the Second World War. And my heart goes out to the countries which are being heavily impacted because they neighbor Ukraine. And of course, we must have solidarity to other countries who are not members of the G7 or the European Union, such as Moldova. So we have already begun implementing strategies to resettle refugees. France has already carried out actions in that direction. What we have asked of our partners in G7 is to show solidarity and working with Europe and continentals, the British, the Canadians, etc., to help us through the UNHCR to be able to share this burden. And this is also what will allow us to fight effectively against all forms of human trafficking and to protect families, women, and children who are currently in a very vulnerable situation. There is also solidarity in terms of energy. Europe, and this is also a natural characteristic of our geography, Europe is the main purchaser of fossil fuels because we are not producers. So we depend on gas and coal from Russia, as well as oil. So we have to keep prices down for our consumers. We'll come back to that later at the European Council. But we also have to diversify our sources. We have to reduce our purchases from Russia. We have to reduce our dependence on Russian gas and oil. This means diversifying our supplies in consultation with the other members of the G7. Some members can increase their production of hydrocarbons. We can also implement strategies for diversification, with a special role being played by the United States and Canada, because in fossil fuels they can make an important contribution. So we would like to reinforce cooperation to reduce our dependencies. This is extremely important, and all this is in complementarity of pulling out of fossil fuels, which is our main choice, and fully coherent with our climate strategy. However, we do know that all of this takes time, and in the meantime, we have to diversify our energy sources. This is where cooperation is so essential within the G7. And lastly, and I would like to insist on this, this is food solidarity. I've said this on several occasions. Ukraine, just as Russia, are major producers of cereals. And currently, we're feeling impacts in Europe. There is tension on prices and in several sectors, which has led France and Europe to implement resilience plans to assist our farmers who rely on oil cakes from Ukraine to feed their cattle. So we are currently shoring up our stocks. But we all have to face an increase in prices. Above all, we are entering a food crisis without precedent. Other countries in the Middle East, in Africa, are dependent on this to feed their populations. So dependent on what is currently being produced in Ukraine and Russia, the choices that were made by Russia, which are absolutely terrible, and which is the direct, so this is the direct consequence of the choices of Russia, which mean that countries such as Egypt and also in Northern Africa, in the Middle East, are now having difficulty finding enough supplies in cereals and in wheat. 85% of Egypt's imports are from Ukraine and Russia. In the short term, there will be difficulties in these countries. In addition, the war in Ukraine has made it impossible, because of Russia, to improve the situation. So we will be in a very serious crisis within 12 to 18 months. Food crisis, a very serious humanitarian crisis in many countries, and massive political consequences in many of the countries I mentioned. We cannot remain powerless. We must react through the actions we are carrying out, in the exchanges as well that I have with President Putin, where I call upon him to implement a ceasefire immediately, to allow for the possibility of people to continue sowing their fields. But above and beyond a ceasefire, Russia must not cause a famine. But we must also build the future by allowing our own producers to increase their yield. And in the name of France and as President of the European Council for these 6 months, at European level and in coordination with the African Union, and I've just spoken with Macky Sall, current chair, at the time of the health crisis with the ACTA initiative, the initiative we would like to launch now with Chair Macky Sall, called Food and Agriculture Resilience Mission Farm, will allow us to immediately organize with the countries concerned, with the private sector, to overcome these difficulties, to ease tensions on commodities markets, to release stores in case of shortages. Several countries are continuing to increase their stores, but those have to be freed as quickly as possible. We also need a multilateral commitment to not make the situation worse. So we need to do what we did when we were faced with the health crisis 2 years ago. So we have to have transparency around agricultural markets, using the information systems we have available. This first trade pillar will be organized very closely with the World Trade Organization. A second pillar of solidarity is to prepare for the effects of war this summer, with coordinated efforts by producer countries, increasing yields whenever possible without having any impact on sustainability, to ensure that those who are most vulnerable can have access to the resources they need at a reasonable price. This means, very concretely, for us, as Europeans, that we must produce more while respecting our rules, our standards, ensuring we respect the climate and biodiversity. But we have to contribute to these efforts of solidarity. And the third pillar in favor of production in the countries most hard hit by increasing investment in sustainable food production and sustainable value chains, by intensifying these operations to allow countries who depend most on imports from Ukraine and Russia to produce more locally. And this is coherent with what we launched in January 2021 with, as you must remember, the initiative of the Great Green Wall, with the initiatives on vegetable protein, which was accelerated under French presidency, for agricultural development and to reduce deforestation in the countries along the Gulf of Guinea all the way to the Horn of Africa, allowing them to produce more locally. And that's an initiative that I wanted to present here. I talked about it during the G7 meeting to colleagues who are all producing countries. And I think we have to be exemplary in terms of our capacity to produce more. And within the European Council meeting, I will come back to this. And we will do more as well in the framework of the G20, hand in hand with the African Union and all of the countries most heavily impacted. Those are the elements I wanted to talk about here in the context. And I also wanted to announce the French initiative for food security.